This is the image they tried to bury. A Canadian flag flying over a NATO command post in Brussels, flanked by the flags of Germany, France, Italy, and the United Kingdom, while the stars and stripes hangs limp and off to the side, almost out of frame. For the first time in the 77-year history of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, a middle power, Canada, is leading a defense architecture that the United States is not part of. As of Friday morning, February 27, 2026, the Western Alliance has undergone a tectonic realignment that no pundit, no Pentagon strategist, no Oval Office advisor saw coming 12 months ago. Mark Carney, the former central banker turned prime minister, has pulled off something that defense analysts are calling the most significant reordering of transatlantic security since the fall of the Berlin Wall. NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte said it himself at Davos last month. Canada is back. They got to the 2%. They have a plan to reach 5%. They are massively helping out with Ukraine. Since Carney became prime minister, Canada is really back in NATO, back in defending the transatlantic alliance. But here is what Rutte did not say out loud, what nobody in the official communiques will admit. The reason Canada is back is because the United States checked out. We are talking about a $6.6 billion defense industrial strategy unveiled 10 days ago in Montreal. We are talking about an $80 billion five-year military spending surge. We are talking about the first non-European nation ever admitted to the European Union's $162 billion safe weapons procurement program. We are talking about NATO conducting its largest military exercise of 2026, Steadfast Dart, with 10,000 troops from 11 nations and 0 American soldiers on the ground. We are talking about the systematic dismantling of the most integrated defense supply chain in the world, the one between Ottawa and Washington, being ripped apart by policy, by design, and by necessity. In this special report, we are going to break down exactly how Mark Carney turned Donald Trump's insults into a defense revolution. We are going to explain the financial plumbing behind the SAFE agreement and why it locks American contractors out of $150 billion in European procurement. We are going to show you why the Pentagon is panicking behind closed doors, and we are going to answer the question nobody in Washington wants to ask. Has the United States already lost the alliance it built? Buckle up. The maps are being redrawn in real time. To understand why NATO is rallying behind Ottawa instead of Washington this week, you have to understand the original sin, the moment the fracture became irreversible. Remember the 2024 NATO summit in Washington. Members of Congress from both parties publicly humiliated Canada for not having a plan to meet the 2% defense spending target. Justin Trudeau dismissed it as a crass mathematical calculation. Canada was spending 1.37% of GDP on defense. Half the submarine fleet was unseaworthy. 46% of Army armored vehicles were classified as unserviceable. 55% of the Air Force fleet was grounded for maintenance. Canada was, by every measurable standard, a defense freeloader. Trump said it, Europe said it, even Canadians knew it. Then came the 51st state remarks, then came the tariffs, then came the economic force threats, and something broke inside the Canadian psyche. According to a Globe and Mail poll conducted by Nanos Research, only 9% of Canadians now agree that the United States is a trustworthy ally. 9%. That is not a diplomatic disagreement. That is a civilizational divorce. Mark Carney did not cause this rupture. He inherited it, but he weaponized it. Here is what Carney understood that Washington still does not. The old bargain, America provides security, allies provide compliance, is dead, and the nation that moves first to build the replacement architecture captures the strategic position for a generation. On June 9, 2025, standing at the University of Toronto's Munk School of Global Affairs, Carney delivered the speech that rewired the Western Alliance. He called it a hinge moment. The era of United States dominance on the world stage is over, he said. The United States is beginning to monetize its hegemony, charging for access to its markets and reducing its relative contributions to collective security. Rising great powers are now in strategic competition with America. A new imperialism threatens. Those words, spoken by the leader of America's closest ally, landed like a thermobaric weapon inside the Beltway. Sources inside the State Department describe the reaction as stunned disbelief. But Carney was not bluffing. He backed the rhetoric with an additional $6.5 billion in immediate defense spending, accelerating the 2% NATO target from 2032 to March 2026, a full decade ahead of schedule. Now let us talk about the financial architecture, because this is where it gets technical and this is where the real power shift is happening. On February 14, 2026, at the Munich Security Conference, Canadian Defense Minister David McGuinty signed Canada into the European Union's Security Action for Europe program. SAFE. This is not a handshake agreement. This is a $162 billion loan-backed procurement instrument, the largest common defense purchasing mechanism in European history, and Canada just became the first non-European country ever admitted. Here is what that means in practice. Canadian defense companies can now bid on any safe-financed contract across all 27 EU member states. Canadian content can comprise up to 80% of the total value of any procurement conducted under the instrument. That is not a typo. 80% Canadian content in European defense contracts. The previous threshold for non-European countries was 35%. Canada paid a $10 million entry fee. The United Kingdom, by comparison, was asked to pay between $4 billion and $6.75 billion for the same access. London balked. The talks collapsed. Canada walked in and signed. The strategic implications are staggering. But here is the catch, and this is what nobody in the mainstream defense press is talking about. The SAFE instrument is designed by regulatory architecture to reduce dependence on American defense contractors. Under the SAFE framework, procurement contracts must ensure that components originating outside the EU, EEA states, Ukraine, and now Canada do not exceed 35% of the total cost. Read that again. American-made components are capped at 35% of any SAFE-funded weapon system. For a country that has dominated NATO procurement for 7 decades, this is a financial decapitation strike. Lockheed Martin, Raytheon, Northrop Grumman, Boeing Defense, the titans of the American military-industrial complex, are being systematically locked out of a $150 billion market that they previously owned. And Canada, America's neighbor, America's most integrated defense partner, the country that shares NORAD, is the one holding the door open for the Europeans and slamming it shut on Washington. Sources at the Pentagon describe the mood as livid. One senior defense official reportedly told colleagues that Ottawa just handed Brussels the keys to the next generation of Western rearmament. It gets worse. Carney's Defense Industrial Strategy, the DIS, unveiled on February 17th at CAE headquarters in Montreal, is the most aggressive reshoring of military production any NATO ally has attempted in the post-Cold War era. The numbers are breathtaking. Canada will invest $180 billion directly in defense procurement over the next decade. An additional $290 billion will flow into defense and security-related infrastructure. The strategy is projected to create 125,000 jobs. The share of defense contracts awarded to Canadian companies will jump from roughly 1/3 to 70%. And here is the buried leady that the financial press has barely touched. Canada has committed to doubling total defense expenditures by the end of this decade. That is an additional $80 billion over the next 5 years alone. When you add the NATO commitment of 5% of GDP on defense and domestic resilience by 2035, you are looking at $900 billion in total defense spending over 10 years. From a country that was spending 1.37% of GDP on its military 18 months ago. This is not incremental growth. This is a wartime mobilization posture from a nation that is not at war. The question is, who is the enemy? This is where the situation moves from financial restructuring to geopolitical crisis. The Defense Industrial Strategy document itself contains language that reads like a declaration of strategic independence. Long-held assumptions have been upended, it states, about the end of imperial conquest, the durability of peace in Europe, and the resilience of old alliances. In this uncertain world, it is more important than ever that Canada possess the capacity to sustain its own defense and safeguard its own sovereignty. Read between those lines. The old alliances reference is not about NATO's relationship with Russia. It is about NATO's relationship with the United States. Canada is building a defense industrial base specifically designed to function without American participation. The F-35 fighter jet purchase, an $88 billion order from Lockheed Martin, is under active review. Ottawa is considering bids from South Korea and a joint German-Norwegian consortium for new submarines. The over-the-horizon radar system that will anchor Canada's Arctic surveillance was purchased from Australia, not from Raytheon, in what Canberra called its biggest-ever defense export. The United States was reportedly caught off guard by the deal. Meanwhile, NATO just conducted its largest exercise of 2026 without a single significant American military presence. Steadfast Dart 26, launched January 15th by Allied command operations, deployed 10,000 troops from 11 nations, 17 ships, 20 aircraft, and 1,500 pieces of heavy equipment, including tanks and missile systems. Germany commanded the exercise. Turkey provided the second-largest contingent. The Allied Reaction Force, NATO's new rapid deployment spearhead, was tested for the first time under Joint Force Command Brunsum. The scenario simulated rapid force projection from southern Europe to the eastern flank, the exact corridor Russia would target in a Baltic conflict. The United States was not there. Let that sink in. The most powerful military in human history, the country that has held the position of Supreme Allied Commander Europe since the Cold War began, sat out the alliance's biggest exercise of the year. Pentagon officials claimed they wanted to test Europe's ability to respond without Washington. Defense analysts in Berlin and London told reporters the real reason. The Trump administration is systematically reducing America's role in the alliance. The Secretary of Defense did not attend the last NATO ministerial meeting. There is open discussion about the United States relinquishing the Saisier position entirely. Here is where the psychological dimension becomes critical. Donald Trump spent years demanding that NATO allies spend more on defense. He called them delinquent. He called them freeloaders. He publicly humiliated Canada at summits. He threatened to abandon allies who did not meet the 2% target. Well, they called his bluff. Canada hit 2%. Europe is surging toward 5%. The $150 billion SAFE instrument is operational. The Steadfast Dart exercise proved the Europeans can coordinate without American logistics. And now the allies are using their new spending not to buy American weapons, but to build their own. Trump wanted his allies to pay more. He did not want them to pay someone else. This is the catastrophic miscalculation at the heart of the administration's NATO strategy. By treating the alliance as a protection racket, by monetizing hegemony, as Carney put it, Washington created the incentive structure for its own replacement. Every dollar that Canada spends on Korean submarines instead of American ones, every euro that flows through SAFE into European defense firms instead of Lockheed Martin, every radar system purchased from Australia instead of Raytheon is a permanent structural loss for the American defense industrial base. These are not one-time purchases. These are 30-year platform commitments with integrated supply chains, maintenance contracts, and technology transfer agreements. Once an ally buys a Korean submarine, they are locked into Korean spare parts, Korean training programs, Korean upgrades for 3 decades. The revenue is gone. The influence is gone. The interoperability is degraded. And here is what nobody is talking about. The SAFE agreement gives Canadian defense firms preferential access to European procurement at the same level as EU member states, non-discriminatory treatment. That means a Canadian company building drone systems in Ottawa has the same bidding rights as a German company in Munich, but an American company in Virginia does not. Canada, which shares the most integrated defense supply chain in the world with the United States, just got better access to European weapons markets than America itself has. The strategic betrayal, from Washington's perspective, is total. Sources inside the National Security Council reportedly described the SAFE signing at Munich as a knife in the back wrapped in a NATO flag. But from Ottawa's perspective, the logic is airtight. Trump threatened to annex Canada. He imposed tariffs that devastated Canadian industry. He called their country the 51st state. He weaponized the NORAD relationship as leverage. What did Washington expect? That Ottawa would keep writing blank checks to Lockheed Martin while the president mused about economic force against their sovereignty? Let us push the scenario to the extreme and talk about what happens next, because the cascade has only just begun. At the NATO summit in The Hague last June, allies committed to spending 5% of GDP on defense by 2035, with 3.5% on core military capabilities and 1.5% on security-related investments. Canada has committed to meeting this target. That means Ottawa will be spending roughly $45 billion per year on domestic resilience alone, on top of its core defense budget. The total over a decade approaches $1 trillion. But here is the structural problem that nobody in Washington has solved. As allies build autonomous defense industrial bases, the argument for American leadership of NATO evaporates. If Europe can conduct Steadfast Dart without American troops, if Canada can arm itself without American contractors, if the SAFE instrument can finance rearmament without American capital, then what exactly does Washington bring to the table? Nuclear deterrence. That is the answer, and it is the only answer. The conventional military architecture that justified 7 decades of American leadership is being rebuilt from scratch without American participation. The alliance is not dying. It is being reborn. But the new NATO does not have Washington at the center. It has Brussels and, increasingly, Ottawa. What does Putin think when he sees this? What does Xi Jinping think? According to defense analysts in both Moscow and Beijing, they see something paradoxical. The Western alliance is simultaneously weaker and stronger. Weaker because the internal cohesion, the automatic assumption that an attack on one triggers a unified American-led response, is shattered. Stronger because the Europeans and Canadians are actually spending real money, building real capabilities, and training for real scenarios for the first time in a generation. Russia's Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov acknowledged it last month. "We are watching it," he said about the European rearmament. But the Kremlin's calculation is evolving. A NATO without guaranteed American participation is a NATO that can be tested. A NATO without American nuclear commitment is a NATO that can be challenged. And a NATO where the allies are fighting over procurement contracts and defense industrial policy is a NATO that might hesitate at the moment of crisis. This is the danger zone, the transition period, the years between the old American-led architecture and whatever replaces it is the window of maximum vulnerability, and we are standing in the middle of it. History teaches us that alliances fracture not in moments of strength, but in moments of renegotiation. The Delian League collapsed when Athens started treating its allies as subjects rather than partners. The Holy Alliance fractured when the great powers began prioritizing commerce over collective security. The concert of Europe died when nations started building independent military capabilities outside the shared framework. Every one of these precedents ended the same way. The hegemon lost control not because it was defeated, but because it demanded too much, offered too little, and assumed the architecture was permanent. The founders of NATO understood this. Article 5 was designed not as a favor from Washington, but as a mutual commitment. The North Atlantic Treaty does not say the United States will defend Europe. It says an armed attack against one shall be considered an attack against all. The genius of that language was its symmetry. Trump destroyed the symmetry. He made the alliance transactional. He put a price tag on collective defense. And now the bill is being paid not to Washington, but to Ottawa, to Brussels, to Seoul, to Canberra. This is not just a defense story. This is the stress test of the American-led international order. Can a superpower maintain its alliance network while simultaneously threatening its allies? Can the world's largest defense exporter survive being locked out of the world's largest new procurement instruments? Can the United States project power when its closest neighbor is deliberately building a military that does not depend on American systems? These are not rhetorical questions. They have dollar figure answers. And the numbers are catastrophic for Washington. The American defense industry employs 2.1 million workers. It generates over $400 billion in annual revenue. Roughly 30% of that comes from allied procurement. If the SAFE instrument, the Canadian DIS, and the broader allied reshoring trend reduce American market share by even 15%, you are looking at $60 billion in annual revenue losses, hundreds of thousands of jobs, and a hollowing out of the industrial base that builds the weapons America itself depends on. The F-35 production line requires allied orders to remain economically viable. The submarine industrial base needs foreign contracts to sustain its workforce between domestic orders. The missile defense architecture depends on allied co-investment. When allies stop buying American, America stops being able to afford its own military at current scale. That is the hidden domino. That is the chain reaction nobody in Congress is talking about. So as we wrap this analysis, understand the gravity of what has happened in the last 10 days. Canada launched the most ambitious defense industrial strategy in its history. NATO conducted its largest exercise without American troops. The European Union admitted Canada into its $150 billion weapons procurement club while shutting out the United Kingdom and effectively capping American participation. Denmark signed a defense cooperation memorandum with Canada focused on Arctic and North Atlantic security, the same Arctic that Trump has been threatening to dominate through Greenland. And Mark Carney stood in Montreal and said the words that will echo through the history books. A sovereign country can defend itself and has local industries that support its defense. A free country can act autonomously by doing what is best for its people, putting its interests, its jobs, and its aspirations above all else. Watch the NATO ministerial meetings in March. Watch for the F-35 review decision, which sources in Ottawa say could come within weeks. Watch for the submarine contract announcement, which will tell you whether Canada has permanently pivoted away from American defense systems. Watch the SAFE disbursements, because when those first $150 billion in loans start flowing to European defense firms with Canadian content requirements, the structural shift becomes irreversible. But most importantly, watch Washington. Watch for the retaliation. Watch for the tariff escalation. Watch for the NORAD leverage play. Because a cornered hegemon does not quietly accept the loss of its alliance. It lashes out. and Donald Trump sitting in the Oval Office, watching his neighbor build a military designed to function without him, watching his allies train without his troops, watching his defense contractors lose contracts to Korean and European competitors, is not a man known for quiet acceptance. The walls of the American-led order are not being breached from the outside. They are being rebuilt by allies into something new. And this time, the architect is not Washington. It is Ottawa. Subscribe. Stay tuned. The history books are being written this week, and the chapter on American hegemony may have just ended.